Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 385. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Got a lot to talk about in today's show, so just want to quickly remind people you can find the show at the Libertarian Institute, where me and Connor both work. We both write articles there, so check out the Libertarian Institute frequently to find what we're putting out aside from the show. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. It's up everywhere you could listen to podcasts, so if you're new, subscribe. If you're a repeat listener, share it out. Help us get it out there. You can find the show and follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. All right, Connor, let's get into it. First article today I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, and as with pretty much anything at the Institute, you and Will Porter are always helping out. So Russian diplomats issued dire warnings that war with U.S. is close. The Kremlin's top diplomat has warned that Western involvement in Ukraine is nearing the point of no return, accusing the United States and the NATO bloc of attempting to transform the country into a Russia-phobic military stronghold. Meanwhile, Moscow's UN envoy declared that all of the Russian red lines have already been crossed. Addressing lawmakers at the Russia State Duma on Wednesday, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov outlined the causes of the current conflict with Ukraine and the deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations, saying that Washington has a maniacal desire for a neo-colonial unipolar world order. An integral part of this policy is a long-standing containment of Russia, including through the expansion of NATO towards our borders, as well as the transformation of the fraternal Ukraine into a Russia-phobic military stronghold, he said. In recent years, this line of Washington and its European satellites has reached the point of no return. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Washington and several other Western states gave assurances to Moscow that NATO alliance would not expand beyond Germany. However, in the years since, Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump had each allowed new members to join the alliance, all of them inching closer to Russia's border. Starting in 2008, NATO repeatedly declared its intention to someday allow Ukraine to become a member, again reiterating the pledge at the recent alliance summit just a couple months ago. The move would cross the brightest of all red lines for Moscow, as was previously noted by then State Department official and current CIA Director William Burns, who penned the 2008 memo warning of the geopolitical perils of extending membership to Kiev. Still, President Joe Biden has refused to change course, insisting it is up to Ukraine whether it will join the U.S.-led military bloc, while effectively making Kiev a de facto member in the alliance. In an interview with Newsweek on Tuesday, Russia's UN envoy argued that the West has not respected Moscow's core security concerns and has become directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine. All of the red lines have already been crossed by Western countries. There is already a semi-direct involvement of NATO in the conflict because not only weapons but its intelligence, he said. The situation when the targets of certain artillery system, in particular HIMARS, these targets can be only hit with the coordination of Washington. Last week, the Washington Post reported that Ukraine relies on American intelligence for selecting targets. Since the start of last year, the White House has authorized the shipment of main battle tanks and long-range rockets to Kiev. Additionally, NATO appears to be prepared to send Western-made warplanes to Ukraine. It means that NATO is not only providing weapons, but are also choosing the targets for Ukrainian strikes, the Russian ambassador to the UN said. He went on to allege that citizens from NATO countries are already fighting, as well as getting captured and killed in Ukraine. We know that this is from people in the battlefield that are captured and the bodies that we see on the battlefield. Now, he did have another sentence where it kind of makes it clear, it sounds like what he's saying is that Russia doesn't assess that there are any NATO troops in uniform fighting against the Russian forces. But it is just a statement that was printed in Newsweek, so it's kind of hard to tell exactly what he meant there. The ambassador said Western weapons would only escalate the conflict, even warning that foreign intervention could eventually trigger a nuclear war. It's abundantly clear that delivery of weapons to the conflict zone, of course, is like pouring oil onto the fire, he said, adding, you are dealing with a nuclear power and you are citing the goal of inflicting defeat to this nuclear power, you should all have all the options in mind for our possible response. In their remarks, both diplomats also pointed to the potential American involvement in the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Last week, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell report claiming that Washington planned to bomb the pipelines even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The White House has denied it had any parts in the sabotage, though Senator Mike Lee later acknowledged it was possible. On Wednesday, the Russian ambassador to the UN said that Moscow has requested a meeting at the international body to address Hersh's reporting. Lavrov rejected the denials from the Biden administration, saying the West is lying, hiding the truth about the terrorist attacks on the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, just as they lied about the Minsk agreements. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel claimed the Minsk agreement, which was ostensibly meant to end the civil war in Ukraine, was really intended to give Kiev time to build up its military. In December 1st interview, Merkel stated that she believes that during the Minsk talks, she was able to buy the time Ukraine needed to better fend off a Russian attack. And so, Connor, I think this is an extremely important article. I know that I wrote it, but I think, the Russia is really trying to communicate that, this war is nearing a very serious point of escalation. Now, we're also getting some interesting statements from Washington here and signals from Washington and the West. U.S. training Ukrainians on how to use less ammunition as the supplies dwindle. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, February 15th. The U.S. is trying to train the Ukrainians to change the way they fight so they use far fewer artillery munitions as NATO says its stockpiles are dwindling. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin detailed the effort after a meeting with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Brussels on Tuesday. We are working with the Ukrainian soldiers in various places throughout Europe to emphasize additional training on maneuver, so as they place more emphasis on maneuver and shaping the battlefield with fires than maneuvering, there's a good chance that they will require less artillery munition, but that is left to be seen, Austin told reporters. The defense secretary acknowledged that Ukraine has used a lot of artillery ammunition and said that the U.S. is doing everything it can to keep the ammo flowing. We're going to do everything we can, working with our international partners to ensure them that they have as much ammunition as quickly as possible, and we will do everything we can to sustain our efforts there as well. The U.S. is sending Ukraine an enormous amount of artillery ammunition, specifically 155 millimeter shells. As a result, the Pentagon is planning to increase its production of artillery shells by 500% over the next few years to meet the Ukrainian demand and also maintain Pentagon stockpiles. But even with steps to increase production, it is not clear if the policy of flooding Ukraine with ammo is sustainable. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Monday that Ukraine is using way more munitions than the alliance can produce. The war in Ukraine is consuming an enormous amount of munitions and depleting allied stockpiles. Stoltenberg said the current rate of Ukraine ammunition expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production. This puts our defense industry under strain. So, this, Connor, especially compared with this next article, is pretty interesting. Ukraine to receive fewer German-made Leopard tanks than promised. And this from the German defense minister, that Ukraine will not be receiving as many German-made Leopard 2 tanks as promised, at least in the near term. Ukraine was promised 2 full battalions by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which totals 62 tanks. But the foreign minister said Western allies are struggling to put that many together. According to Bloomberg, only Germany and Portugal have planned to send the A6 model of Leopard 2 tanks. So that's not looking great for Ukraine. They're running out of munitions and everything. U.S. wants to help Ukraine retake more territory before negotiating with Putin. This from Dave DeCamp on February 14th. Washington reported on Monday that the Biden administration officials say they want to help Ukraine retake as much territory as it can from Russia over the next few months before they sit down at the negotiating table with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is kind of interesting, Connor, because Ukraine is currently losing territory. Not sure how they plan for Ukraine to take more territory. But, if they are looking to negotiate, it seems like the time would be now before this major Russian offensive starts. But, they are talking about engaging in talks in the spring. Now, this is really interesting. A little bit aside from the war, but Zelensky signs an agreement with J.P. Morgan on Ukraine Reconstruction, and it's just interesting how there's all these companies that likely are invested in the American military-industrial complex, and so not only are they making weapons, making money selling weapons to Ukraine, leading to the further destruction of Ukraine, but then they're also going to make a lot of money once the war is over and Ukraine needs to be rebuilt. The last the story up I have here today before I hand it over to Connor: EU wants to use frozen Russian funds to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. And Connor, the headline pretty much says it all here. I just want to point out that if the EU moves forward with this, I think the real risk is that this essentially made sure the war is frozen forever and will continue forever. Stealing a whole bunch of Russian money will likely be something that Russia severely objects to, and won't agree to any kind of resolution or giving back any Ukrainian territory as long as their funds are being held. So, Connor, give us some updates on China and Iran here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So this one is from Dave DeCamp on February 13th at antiwar.com. And it gives you a window into how hawkish the new Congress is and what they're looking forward to as far as their China policy now. They were inspired, evidently, by Nancy Pelosi's debacle of a trip to Taiwan last year. So they're going to try and do that again and again. So we're looking at members of the newly formed House Committee on China are in talks about sending a delegation to Taiwan, knowing full well that it will infuriate Beijing and likely raise military tensions in the region. So this is the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, which was formed on January 10th after the GOP took majority control of the chamber. A senior member of the panel, this is Representative Rob Whitman, he's from Virginia, told the Nikkei Asia outlet that he and other committee members are considering making the trip to Taiwan. Quote, "We know that will infuriate the Chinese, but I think it's incredibly important for us to do that because you have to send the signal that we're strongly on the side of Taiwan." House Republican leadership is also planning to visit Taiwan, including House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Michael McCall, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. McCall recently said he plans to lead a delegation to Taipei this spring and that McCarthy's trip could be even sometime next year or later this year. And McCarthy's planning to make his trip. Of course, even though when Pelosi went there in August last year, it provoked the largest ever Chinese military exercises around Taiwan. They simulated a blockade on the island and fired missiles over the island and sent warplanes over the median line virtually every single day now since then. They've kept up the pressure. And so, but a senior Pentagon official told the same outlet that Whitman was speaking to, they said that more congressional delegations visiting Taiwan will escalate military tensions indeed and provoke a response from the Chinese People's Liberation Army. The official said, we think they're always prepared to do something of that nature. We saw that with the quickness that the PLA was able to respond to Speaker Pelosi's visit. And, of course, I know you discussed it on a recent show, but it was incredible to see after the tensions raised to the degree with the balloon hysteria and Blinken canceling his trip and the Chinese not being able to, or excuse me, the Lloyd Austin's counterpart, I think, understandably refusing to speak to him after they shot down their meteorological weather balloon with an F-22. But anyway, I mean, after that, the U.S. was carrying out these, the Navy and the Marines were carrying out war drills with the USS Nimitz and another aircraft carrier strike group in the South China Sea over the weekend, training for war on China's doorstep. So they are content to continue raising tensions, just like with Russia, although hopefully that's changing now soon. But the next piece we have here is China says the U.S. sent 10 balloons over its territory since last year. Okay. So to give some perspective, this is from the 13th from Dave DeCamp. We have the Chinese Foreign Ministry on Monday saying that since 2022, the U.S. has sent 10 high-altitude balloons over its airspace. The ministry also refuted these continuing allegations that the Chinese balloon the U.S. shot down was a surveillance device. During a press conference, Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, quote, U.S. balloons have often entered other countries' airspace illegally. Since last year, U.S. high-altitude balloons have flown over Chinese airspace over 10 times without authorization from China. The U.S. needs to reflect on its own behavior and change course rather than attacking others and stoking confrontation. Wang didn't specify whether China thought the balloons were used for surveillance purposes. In response to his comments, the White House said that any claims that the U.S. has sent, quote, surveillance balloons into China were false. Now, while the White House denied that those were that it had sent surveillance balloons to China, and Wang's claim isn't confirmed, there are indications that the U.S. has deployed these kinds of devices or was at least planning to. So, for instance, in July 2022, Politico reported that the Pentagon was planning to deploy surveillance balloons to use against China and Russia. The report said the high-altitude inflatables flying at between 60,000 and 90,000 feet would be added to the Pentagon's extensive surveillance network and could eventually be used to track hypersonic weapons. Ironically, after initially throwing cold water on the most hysterical rhetoric in Congress in response to China's weather balloon, the Pentagon later referred to it as quote, part of a vast Chinese aerial surveillance program. Okay, so in 2019, just more projection going on here. So in 2019, the Pentagon tested surveillance balloons by launching 25 inside the United States from South Dakota. But there's no indication that any were sent outside of the country. The ostensible purpose of testing the balloons was to see if they could, quote, provide a persistent surveillance system to locate and deter narcotic trafficking and other homeland security threats. Now, Wang also mentioned the surveillance the U.S. is conducting in the South China Sea and the disputed waters there, where there's all these overlapping claims in these Southeast Asian nations. But, most of these disputed waters are claimed by China. And, of course, the U.S. rejects almost all their claims. And then since the Obama era, we've been sending warships very close, provocatively close to their territory. Now, the U.S. military, Wang said the U.S. military vessels and aircraft conduct frequent close-in reconnaissance on China, including 657 sorties last year and 64 sorties in January this year in the South China Sea alone, which seriously undermines China's national security and regional peace and stability. Now, the South China Sea Probing Initiative, which is the Beijing-based think tank, also said the U.S. had conducted 64 surveillance flights over the South China Sea last month. Back in 2001, of course, a U.S. surveillance plane collided with an intercepting Chinese jet off the coast of Hainan Island in the South China Sea. The collision killed the Chinese pilot and forced the American plane to land in Chinese territory. In recent years, the U.S., as we've been discussing this whole time, has been vastly increasing military activity and reconnaissance flights in the South China Sea, making another accident like the Hainan Island incident much more likely. Since the balloon incident, dialogue between the U.S. and China has deteriorated further, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceling his planned visit to China. And as I said earlier, Austin's counterpart is not talking to him. After the balloon was shot down, Wang said that the decision to shoot down the balloon with an F-22 was an overreaction. Quote, we need to point out, however, that the U.S.'s downing of the unmanned airship with advanced missiles is a trigger-happy overreaction. Many in the U.S. have been asking, what good can such costly action possibly bring to the U.S. and its taxpayers, he said. Well said. Now, Wang also pointed out other U.S. global surveillance, including the NSA monitoring phones belonging to world leaders, which was revealed, of course, by Edward Snowden. Wang said, it's quite clear to the global community which country is the number one spy empire in the world. All right, so now we're getting more reports from U.S. officials that they knew where this balloon was launched from and they had been eyeing it the whole time, and that really it is very likely that the Chinese story is pretty accurate, that it ended up in the United States due to unexpected weather. So this is Washington Post, Chinese balloon wound up in the U.S. due to unexpected weather, by Dave DeCamp on the 14th at antiwar.com. So the Chinese balloon that wound up over the continental United States likely ended up there by accident due to unexpected weather. And the Post reported this on Tuesday. And U.S. officials told the Post that the U.S. intelligence had been tracking the balloon since it had been launched from Hainan Island in southern China. And they expected it to travel over the U.S. territory of Guam where the United States Marine Corps just opened a new base explicitly to prepare for a future war with China. And according to computer modeling conducted by the Post, the balloon was sent north due to a cold front and was then spotted over Alaska's Aleutian Islands. Ordinary conditions would have kept the balloon on a more west to east course, but the balloon then headed east over Canada and was blown down south to the U.S. by strong winds. The Post report said U.S. officials are unsure if the deviation was an accident, but they still insist the balloon was launched by China's military for surveillance and say China took advantage of the fact that it ended up over the U.S. for intelligence purposes. For their part, China continues to deny that the balloon was a spy device and insists it was a meteorological balloon used for civilian purposes. The U.S., of course, took it down on February 4th. Okay. Now we're getting more statements from China about how this whole situation has really deteriorated relations. If there was any hope that there could be some kind of a thaw after the meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping last fall. So China said Wednesday that the U.S. reaction, again, this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on the 15th. Now, China said Wednesday that the U.S. reaction to a Chinese balloon accidentally drifting into U.S. airspace has set back diplomatic progress that was made since President Biden met with Chinese President Xi in Bali, Indonesia, back in November. So we have Wang Wenbian saying this is a clear overreaction, seriously contravenes the spirit of international law and customary international practice, referring to the shoot down of the balloon. Now, Wang also said what the U.S. did has had a grave impact on the efforts and progress made by China and the U.S. in stabilizing bilateral relations since the leaders' meeting in Bali. After Biden and Xi met in Bali, other high-level U.S. and Chinese officials made a point to hold talks, although the Biden administration made clear the dialogue was about managing competition rather than resolving issues. But after the Pentagon first announced a Chinese balloon was in its airspace, Secretary of State Antony Blinken seized the event as a convenient excuse to cancel his planned trip to China. Despite Blinken canceling his trip, the State Department insists it will maintain communication with China. And this is Wendy Sherman saying, she's the Deputy Secretary of State, saying, we are and we will maintain open lines of communication with the PRC so we can responsibly manage the competition between our countries. Wang reiterated China's position that the balloon entered U.S. airspace by accident. The Washington Post appeared to confirm Beijing's stance with its recent reporting we just discussed. The White House also admitted that the three objects U.S. military shot down after the Chinese weather balloon were likely, quote, totally benign and weren't linked to China. U.S. officials still maintain that the Chinese balloon was a surveillance device, an accusation Beijing, of course, denies. And there's just more details here that the high-altitude balloons that Wang referenced earlier, launched by the U.S. that traveled over their territory, he said that they were specifically flying over Xinjiang and Tibet. Since May last year, the U.S. has released a large number of high-altitude balloons from its territory, which have continuously circled the globe and illegally flown over China's airspace, including Xinjiang and Tibet, more than 10 times, at least without the approval of relevant Chinese authorities, Wang said. The U.S. has denied that it sent these surveillance balloons over China, but again, Wang didn't say that they were necessarily surveillance balloons. And of course, U.S. and China have advanced satellites with these surveillance capabilities that make, doing anything like this really unnecessary. But as we said earlier, we know that the Pentagon has at least a couple of different programs that they're working on. And they certainly did this kind of stuff during the Cold War, launching surveillance balloons over the Soviet Union and over China. Okay. Now, we're going to move on to Iran here. So this is another article from antiwar.com on February 9th. From Dave DeCamp again, the U.S. hits Iran with fresh sanctions that target petrochemicals. So we're getting back to where instead of sanctioning Iran's security services over accusations about the way they're dealing with protesters, I'm sure there's more of those coming anyway. But we're back to what they said a couple years ago in the Wall Street Journal was that there's really nothing else to sanction other than Iran's oil trade with East Asia. So that's exactly what they're doing. And so last Thursday, the U.S. hit Iran with fresh sanctions targeting companies accused of facilitating the sale of Iranian petroleum and petrochemicals to Asia. The U.S. Treasury Department said the sanctions targeted 6 Iran-based petrochemical manufacturers or their subsidiaries and 3 firms in Malaysia and Singapore involved in facilitating the sale and shipment of petroleum and petrochemicals. The U.S. has been increasing sanctions throughout the entire Biden administration, but more so now since the indirect talks to revive the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA have been stalled. In November, President Biden was caught on camera infamously saying that the JCPOA is dead, but that he would not officially announce it. And then he qualified that by saying it's a long story. Besides the sanctions, the U.S. has also expressed support for protesters inside Iran and is stepping up its military cooperation with Israel in pretty unprecedented ways. Last month, Washington and Tel Aviv, of course, held their largest ever joint military exercises that involve massive live fire drills in the eastern Mediterranean Sea and in Israel as a message to Iran. The joint exercises also sent a message to the region that the U.S. backs the controversial new Israeli government, which, I mean, some of the, like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, some of these radical, these far-right Israeli politicians make Netanyahu almost look moderate by comparison, which is pretty scary. And they've vowed to expand settlements in the West Bank and eventually annex the territory outright. And following the exercises, Israel launched a drone attack against a military facility in the Iranian city of Isfahan. U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that Israel was responsible for the attack and said it came at a time when the U.S. and Israel were discussing ways to contain Tehran's military capabilities. All right, so just more confirmation here. I know Biden said that it was a long story and that they wouldn't officially announce that the deal was dead, but it looks like they're inching that way anyway. So we have the State Department on Monday saying that there are no discussions on reviving the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So they said, this is from antiwar.com by Dave DeCamp on the 14th. The State Department said Monday the U.S. has not engaged in any discussions on reviving the Iran nuclear deal in the latest sign that the crippling economic sanctions on Iran aren't going anywhere. There has been no discussion of resuscitating the JCPOA. Interesting word choice. This is not on the agenda. It hasn't been on the agenda, and we've engaged with partners, and it hasn't been on the agenda when we've engaged indirectly with the Iranians. So they're not discussing it with their partners or even indirectly with the Iranians anymore. Ned Price said at a press briefing, the State Department spokesman. U.S. officials, of course, have made clear in recent months that they have no intention of trying to revive the deal, and they've said explicitly in Axios and other outlets that even if the Iranians made, any and all concessions at this point and came back and wanted to re-enter the deal under any circumstances, the Americans would still say no, because we're now past that point. We're focused, Foggy Bottom and Washington and the White House are focused on preparing a what Israel would call a credible military threat for Iran. And also they're focusing primarily on what they claim is this deepening military cooperation with Iran and Russia. The details of that remain to be seen. Iran has been very they've said repeatedly that they have not provided Russia with military equipment or drones since the invasion of Ukraine took place, that these sales were made beforehand. And of course, they tried to enter into talks with the Ukrainians, but those were ultimately squashed by the Americans and the Germans. And of course, they're using the protests inside the country as a way to basically put a final nail in the coffin of any diplomacy with Iran, at least until, assuming there's a Republican administration here in 2025, at least until very close to the end of the decade here, if we get another Democrat in office. But the Democrats have less interest in returning to the JCPOA than even Rand Paul does. So I don't see that happening. Now, here's another piece we have from the Cradle from the 16th. She calls for lifting of Iran sanctions to restore nuclear deal. So President Ibrahim Raisi of Iran traveled to Beijing this week, and during a meeting with President Xi on the 15th, Xi called for the lifting of sanctions on Tehran. He considers it essential in moving forward with the nuclear talks with Washington. The aim is to bring the two countries closer to restoring the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In addition, on the final day, the Iranian president's of the final day of Raisi's 3-day visit to China, the two leaders confirmed during a joint statement that Xi has accepted Raisi's invitation to Iran. The two leaders also stressed the urgency for implementing the JCPOA. According to the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Qatar is currently relaying messages between Tehran and other members of the JCPOA. Raisi mentioned to reporters that she has affirmed his support for Iran to join the BRICS economic alliance, adding that Tehran's membership in the bloc will be very fruitful and successful. There was a discussion about Iran's membership in BRICS, and we saw China's desire for this membership, he said. The economic bloc comprises Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, representing over 40% of the global population and holding nearly a quarter of the world's GDP. In June 2022, Iran applied to join the BRICS economic bloc. Speaking to a virtual summit of BRICS Business Forum on June 24th, Raisi expressed his country's readiness to share its vast capabilities and potential to help the bloc again attain its goals. During Raisi's visit, both sides signed a number of bilateral cooperation documents in the fields of agriculture, trade, tourism, environmental protection, health, disaster relief, culture, and sports. In 2021, Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well, the second largest global body besides the UN, a group that accounts for about 1/3 of the world's land, half of the global population, a quarter of the world economy, and exports trillions of dollars annually. The group includes China, Russia, and India, in addition to several Central Asian states. And last year, during a meeting at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting of the leaders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, President Raisi said the relationship between countries that are sanctioned by the U.S., such as Iran, Russia, or other countries, can overcome many problems and issues and make them stronger. The Americans think whichever country they impose sanctions on, it will be stopped. Their perception is a wrong one. And I think as we're seeing the massive blowback from sanctions on Russia, that is proving itself to be true, as these countries in Europe, their economic growth is going down, and Russia is actually, their economy is actually growing economically, and it seems like there's more business going on, or it's starting to approach normal levels now between Europe and Russia. So, as usual, the U.S. is just pushing its enemies together and abandoning the old trilateral diplomacy where they try to split Russia and China from each other. And that, I think they still think they could do that, but that's not going to happen. So we'll see what happens. But again, the deal is dead. So it looks like Iran is looking east and coming up with some other options here that are hopefully fruitful.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that breakdown, and we'll be back with more news next week.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.